Yeah. Looks like they're all talking in different spots, but they're. I lost the button. Oh, that's better. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot quieter in here than it is out there.
Yeah.
Unless they alter that it's a call-in audio or something. That's all I've ever done, so.
Okay, we're gonna call finance to order.
Roll call ag and planning to order. Soil and water is first, Karina.
Hello.
Oh, you are.
You have to accept minutes first.
Oh, sorry, we have to accept the minute. Okay, moved by Jay, seconded by
I'll do that.
Jim. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Okay, Karina, I'll start. Now you can go.
Okay. Just wanted to give you an update that we got a couple of fairly large projects done for the year. $1.2 million project down at Landview Farm in White Creek. It came out very well. The contractor did a great job, and we've made an initial payment to the farm, and we'll be closing out that grant application this fall. And then we did a habitat restoration project on Coulter Brook off County Route 61 in the town of Jackson. That one came together kind of like last minute. We finally got everything to come together with the finances on Thursday or Friday before Labor Day, and the contractor started work on Labor Day. So but that's a really neat project, and it was to help with fish passage and habitat connectivity through a large culvert that otherwise you'd have to replace it. So we added some bed material to the stream and got it so that the fish can go back through the culvert, and hopefully everybody's happy. So, and we still have one project under construction up in Port Ann at Heritage Hill Farm. Hopefully we'll have that wrapped up in probably the next couple of weeks and be able to close that grant. And then we're starting a waste storage project at Twin Brooks Farm in Hartford, and a silage leachate project at the Wolf Farm down in Cambridge. So we're on track to close out the 3 grant applications that are winding down at the end of this year. We will have to file for a couple of extensions on waste storage grants because they are due to end in March, and as nobody has started construction at this point, I don't believe we will get them done before their March deadlines. So we're going to file for 1-year extensions on them, or possibly 2. So, but everything else is pretty much on track as far as our grants, and we should be good with our income projections from the state grants. We're just kind of waiting to hear for round 26 applications and climate resiliency applications that we submitted in the beginning of the year. So budget, we basically are asking to be level funded. We have, we've already always match the county in what we ask for. We're able to be self-supporting in that we, dollar for dollar, we're matching what the county appropriates us and stays in business. And we have been able to build our fund balance to prepare for, future issues. So Brian's familiar with some of the holes we've had to dig ourselves out of. So having a fund balance that is growing instead of continually going in a negative direction is
Yeah,
a
it needed to be
better spot for
restored.
us to be. And when we're dealing with, grants that are $1 million or more, we really need to have that as a part of our risk management to have a healthy fund balance. So, if you got any questions, fire away.
Any questions, Jay Skelly?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment that, what we give them doesn't even cover the salaries and stuff. And when you say somebody has to work so their job depends on it, theirs does, because they aren't generating the projects and the grants, they aren't getting the admin to take care of everybody. So they do a great job down there. Just hopefully, we've had discussions in Soil and Water Committee that the state doesn't dry up some of their programs, because it's really going to affect the bottom line on soil and water. So.
Yeah. Anything else? Very good.
Thank you, Karina.
Thanks, Karina. Good job.
Brian, you're next up.
Okay, so we are asking for level funding in 2021 at $391,000. That currently we are under the assumption that our state funds are going to be cut by 20% in the current fiscal year for 2020. We are planning on covering that, and we fully expect that 20% cut will follow through to 2021. And that's about $13,600 is the 20% cut. Given that, we do expect to come in pretty close to level for 2020. Our expenses are down. We haven't had travel, mileage, professional development funds, but that'll help cover that loss in $13,000 of state funds. Obviously, our program revenues are down. We have not had the number of classes and workshops that we've had in the past. And then our two largest fundraisers, the 4-H food booth and the 4-H milkshake booth, obviously have not been in operation this year. Those two facilities pay for trips and tours, teen leadership opportunities, and 4-H curriculum. So that'll be a loss of about $20,000 between the two of them that we will be losing in program generated revenue. Our Taste New York contract was extended for another year. So we have a contract from June of this year through May of next year. That was cut $4,000 down to $36,000. Our budget includes full participation in the two regional ag teams to the tune of $132,000. Those two teams employ approximately 18 individuals that cover everything from field crops, dairy, livestock, farm business management, apples, grapes, vegetable, post-harvest production, farm business management. And those two, we have the smaller team covers 6 counties and the larger teams covers Clinton County down to Ulster County. We pay into those two teams based on our share of the commodity that we're talking about. Obviously, when we're looking at those counties, Washington County is a strong ag producer in almost every commodity. So we pay proportionally based on our share of those commodities. I did build into the budget a 3% increase. That is not set. The board always wants to put in the 3% and then we adjust as needed once we find out where our all of our funds come in and where we are when we start the year in January. So we set salaries in January once we know what our budget is. Also, just to note that of the $391,000 in county appropriation, $25,000 goes right back to the county to cover rent. So that comes out of our appropriation and goes back to the county. We have fully transitioned to Albany County doing all of our HR and our finance. When our finance person retired, we contracted with Albany County to do all of our finance, our check writing, our books. It's all web-based accounting. It has saved us some money. It hasn't been a huge share because, of course, we have to pay Albany County to do that for us. This year, we are transitioning our accounting software. So there was some added cost as we had to go through creating a new chart of accounts and doing a chart of account cleanups. So it took them a little longer to do that. So we may this year have paid them more than we will next year just because of the extra time. But we are trying to find efficiencies any way we can. We also share HR within the region as well. We did receive a farm to school grant in January. Contracts never came before COVID hit. Schools were closed, so it wasn't a big deal. They were working on those. Then COVID hit and the state budget went out the door. They have still not executed contracts for that. And pretty much the handwriting is on the wall right now that any new projects will not get funded. We are going to try to cover some of those tasks with existing staff. The money that we applied for would have hired a new staff person to do that. There's some tasks that we think we can complete in-house in 2021 as we move forward, depending on where the budget lies. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, if there's any questions. And I did send Sandy a more detailed budget.
So Brian, the regionalization that you guys started is about 6 years ago now, is that right?
So the horticulture team has probably been more like 10, and then the dairy, livestock, farm business management, and agronomy has been about 6 years.
So that's all totally in place now and doing what you wanted it to do as far as streamlining costs and making.
Yes, I think it's been a benefit to the farmers. We haven't heard any producer complain. As far as staff goes, we would never to hire one of they're specialists, so they specialize in their area of knowledge. If we were to hire them, it would be $60,000 to $75,000. So, we would get 2 of those people for the amount that we're paying into the regional team, and we wouldn't have access to the other 12 specialists that we have. With technology these days, they may be housed in Washington County, Saratoga County, Clinton County. But if somebody goes out into their orchard and they see a pest, they take a picture. They text or email the specialist and says, "What is this?" A lot of times it can be diagnosed over the computer. They'll get on Zoom and have a conversation, or they can say, "You know what? I'll be there tomorrow to look at it." So they're not necessarily traveling every day, but it has been a very good program. I think we pay into it based on our proportion of agriculture. I think we're getting $130,000 out of it. I think our producers are happy. I think our producers are more happy because when they ask a question, they know that that's their area expertise. They don't have to turn to somebody else and find the answer, that they're able to do that. This year with COVID, they did a lot of virtual office hours so that producers could come on they set up twice a day, lunchtime and in the evening, that producers could come in and ask questions. They really talked about how to get farm stands up and running, how to comply, how to write their New York Forward plans. So I'm very happy with the programs, and I think if you talk to producers themselves, they would echo the sentiment.
Okay, hey, well, thank you, and I appreciate the fact that knowing the constraints the state's putting you under and realizing we are too, that you came in with the same ask, because it was a tough year to find any extra money for anything, so
Right.
appreciate that.
Any other questions for Brian? Okay, thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Okay. Or, by the time I look through all the plexiglass here, this is hard to see.
So I have a couple of quick things to go over, and do you want me to do them before we go over the budget or after?
Certainly.
Okay. As you all know, the county, appoints, a few members to the Regional Workforce Development Board. We had a couple of terms that expired in this year in September. I was one of them. And then there is another board member who elected not to renew. We, received interest from the Human Resources Director at Fort Miller. And as you all know, Fort Miller is actually our largest employer. The next scheduled Workforce Development Board meeting is in November. Again, I've had a few discussions with her. She's interested. She knows a lot of the regional people. The board, is about to appoint a new executive director as the last one, resigned. So I think, there's gonna be some changes that are happening at the board level, but it's the county's right to make a certain number of appointments. We have a seat to fill. So the question is, do we want to nominate, Mary Ann Spezio from Fort Miller? Do we want to have other conversations with other interested members? I don't know if other people have reached out to other, potential candidates, but we have somebody in hand who's interested and who I think would do a good job.
It's a good fit for our situation, probably. And so, you need a resolution to reappoint you and to appoint someone else, or
It'll
separate
have to go to
resolutions?
full board, so this way we run it through committee and then up to board, so yes.
I'll make the motion to move those.
Moved by Brian, seconded by Jay. Any further discussion or questions?
Awful close to an election, I don't wanna get things in the fall here.
We already got it.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
That will have lasting impact.
I thought you were gonna abstain.
Brian and Cassie, we're looking to do that at the October meeting is when we will do that. So,
Good.
Okay.
thank you.
Okay. And just one other quick thing, we discussed at the last ag planning meeting, the need to hold a board level discussion about the draft of the solid waste management plan, because this meeting really became devoted to budget. We're gonna put that off to September. Deb Donahue requested that the discussion be held at ag planning, but also I think that involving both Joe Grilling and Doug Donahue, Deb Donahue in the discussion would be worth it, but we're gonna, move that off to October. And then from that point, we'll have to, hold the hearings and go through the rest of the process. But the first step is the board level discussion of the draft plan. So for those of you who have not reviewed it, I sent you the links to it. If you don't have it, I can send it again. I suggest that, I saw that one. I suggest that you, review the plan prior to discussion at next month's meeting.
Right through the plexiglass. I must have been over a little bit.
That is clear,
I'm looking through all of the
Still the budget.
Okay, so budget. The planning budget, essentially, you will find that on the expenses other than the, payroll and, payroll benefits, I managed to reduce the overall expenses by about $4,000, which is like, about 3.5% reduced from last year. The biggest reduction was actually in carpool. The reason for that was because at one point I had an assigned county car. I turned that back in, and I'm just, to be honest, primarily using my own car, my own gas, et cetera. So that, significantly reduced the carpool amount, and then there was a few hundred here and a few hundred there that, I managed to trim off so that it came down a little bit. So that cut added with the potential changes in payroll expenses, this potentially equates to
So I'm assuming under grants, so we talked about this morning, Chris, you realized it when it happened. But the $203,000 that we have in grant expenses this year is offset by revenue someplace else in the budget.
So that is the 203,000 is the trail grant. Yes, there is revenue for it.
It's someplace else,
Yeah.
it's not in these pages, it's someplace else.
So there are actually 3 grants where, as of right now, where the revenue is coming through ag planning. One of them is the census grant, we've already received funding for it, and by the way, if you haven't taken a look at the kiosk in the lobby downstairs, we threw up flyers, calling attention to all 17 towns. So the census grant, that part of that revenue is already in. We also are managing the trail grant, which has funding from 2 different agencies. We've just done the first drawdown from one of the agencies, so I think some of that revenue will come in this year. That project is stalled largely because of CP Rail. We've been trying to get interaction for them for almost a year. If we can get past that, I hope to see some revenue from that coming in next year. But the drawdown that we just did for that trail should be reimbursement for almost all of the money that we've already paid out, because we came up with substantial in-kind documentation, so the cash reimbursement, that will be pretty high, against what we've already spent.
We've incurred about $32,500 in expenses this year. Out of the 203 budget, it's gonna catch up, or the other 2 will roll over next year, right?
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions on the planning budget? Third. So, to quickly go over 2020. As you may recall, we were budgeted in 2020 for a total of about $152,000, which included $60,000 in I Love New York funding. So, I Love New York funding, we were notified about 2 months ago that they were going to reimburse for Q1 spending. Q2 was up in the air, and Q3 and 4 were highly unlikely to actually get reimbursed. So, our expenditures that we were able to document for Q1, and based on I Love New York paying 6% of those expenditures, were originally at about $14,600. I Love New York actually came up with a way to reduce that. What they did, we pay an annual payment into the Capital Sarasota region. So what I Love New York did is they took that annual payment and applied it against Q1 expenses. So basically, if the region hadn't spent 100% of its funding in Q1, counties did not get reimbursed for their annual payment.
Who does that?
Right. So it ended up reducing that anticipated payment by a couple of $1,000, although I was just notified today that what they're going to do for Q2 is they'll take that same formula and add up expenditures Q1 and Q2. So we might get a little bit of that couple of $1,000 back, but basically we're not going to get all of it back. The good news in that is I had pretty much written off that we were going to get reimbursed for Q2, but we in fact are going to be reimbursed for Q2. But the way that they found to reduce reimbursement for that is that expenditures had to be made, checks had to be cut and deposited by the end of June. So I'm waiting to find out whether the last check that we paid for our June expenses was actually deposited in June. It's about a $10,000 amount. If it wasn't, we won't get reimbursed for it. If it was, we'll get about an additional $25,000. So it'll be either $15,000 or $25,000 in reimbursement for Q2. So if you add all of that up, I had said that we were going to cut tourism spending from that $152,000 budget down to about $100,000. We will get reimbursed either 28 or 38,000 from I Love New York, which means that the county match out of general funds will either be 62 or 72 versus the original budgeted 92. So we cut a pretty substantial amount out of general fund spending for this year. Any questions on that? Okay. So for 2021, as you all know, we recently signed an agreement with Airbnb in which we're going to start collecting, or they're going to be collecting bed tax on our behalf and remitting. We found out yesterday that they're actually going to be remitting on a monthly basis. I'm hoping that that will start sometime in October because they were to start collecting in September. So I'm not sure if that payment in September happens, how late it happens at the end of the month. So based on reviewing documentation from Airbnb, we are anticipating, and it is only a guess because we have to really have at least a year under our belt before I think we can really make guesses as to what revenue to estimate. But we're estimating probably about $50,000 a year in bed tax revenue from Airbnb. We have historically budgeted somewhere around $15,000 to $18,000 in regular bed tax revenue. So for 2020, I would anticipate that, we'll have I'm not sure if we're actually going to get to the $15,000 in typical bed tax revenue. Al might be able to answer that question. It looks like we're about 4 right now. And then we might have another 10 to 15,000 in Airbnb revenue. So, maybe 30,000 in revenue for this year, in basically bed tax collection. So for 2021, what I'm estimating is that 55,000 in revenue coming from general funds, which I'll go into in a minute. Budgeting 25,000 from Airbnb, and if I Love New York holds true with what's happening with a lot of other state programs, and they cut their funding in 2021 down by 20%, that would mean about 50,000 in I Love New York money, which would be a total budget for 2021 of somewhere around 130,000. So the reason that I don't want to use all of or even most of the bed tax revenue is because what I'd like to do is basically start a savings pot to save that money so that by 2022, we're either using very little or no general fund revenue for 2022. But again, it's hard to say. We haven't actually started collecting this money yet, and we don't know exactly what it's going to add up to. But again, so for this year, the 55,000 in general funds, if I Love New York does reduce by 20%, and that equates to about 50,000, then that 50,000 would be the match for I Love New York money. Additionally, you may recall that in this year, Cornell Cooperative Extension has been allocated $10,000, which has been reduced down to 3, but the original allocation was 10, for used to do agritourism related things. So I have 5,000 sitting in there. I don't know if the board wants to continue with that piece of funding, but I assumed that 10,000 was we don't know, given coronavirus, how tourism marketing is even going to look for next year. But I put a placeholder in there for 5,000 for Cornell, and then the 50,000 in county match funds. So again, my hope would be that by 2022, we have enough set aside so that county contributions would be very limited, if at all. But right now, 2021 is a guess. We don't know what I Love New York is going to do. We don't know how long COVID is going to impact tourism. It's obviously been one of the more heavily impacted industries. But for planning purposes for budgeting, The request is for about half of what we budgeted in 2021. So we had 92 in county funds. So again, a little bit more than half.
Of course, COVID has kept us from doing a lot of the travel and tourism things anyway, so if it was gonna work out this way, it's probably the ideal year to have done it, but because nobody could go anywhere, still can't. You're still quarantined in some cases and things like that, so.
Right.
But if
I mean,
it
what
picks
we-
back up, I Love New York will probably come back, you would assume, at some point.
Well, I think the interesting thing is, for 2021, I mean, in my opinion, you could either see continued reductions in tourism because travel and quarantine are still happening, or the converse could be true. You could end up wanting to spend twice as much money because now, all of a sudden, everybody wants to get out, they want to go travel. You want to be supporting businesses that are heavily dependent on tourism. How do you do that? We just don't know what it's going to look like until there's a vaccine and widespread travel again. So it's a bit of a guess, but this is what I'm trying to plan for. Sue?
It's interesting because I know a few Airbnbs in town that are booked right up for the next year, and so because it's so, yeah. And so, the question is, and the other thing is that the trails, that they're so busy behind you, the parking areas are overrun. I don't know how they're doing.
They're pretty busy too.
And it's great, it's wonderful that they're using it, but I think business is going to probably, actually do more business because of the, and that's the reason. I mean, Kevin, is that pretty?
Yeah, I mean, being a rural area with a low COVID rate, people are coming and doing stuff outside, so I don't know if they're spending how much money, but they're great rating.
That's one of the reasons I think it's, we are now collecting data from all the rooms on Airbnb usage, but this is not a model year to be doing predictive analysis because you can't predict anything. I mean, we know we're going to have revenue based on interpretation of historical data. We're estimating it's going to be about 50,000, but we don't really know. We won't know until time.
One more question. Does planting fall under this?
If it's, leased through Airbnb, yes. If it's done traditionally, the short answer is it depends.
So there are other, similar sites to Airbnb. There's Airbnb, there's some sites that handle glamping. As of right now, there is discussion about statewide legislation that would effectively collect a tax on all of those sites. I will tell you what my concern about that is. We obviously moved forward to negotiate with Airbnb. We don't have agreements in place with Airbnb. There aren't any in New York State that I'm aware of.
Fair enough.
My concern is that, on the one hand, it would be really great to have a uniform statewide policy. On the other hand, guess where you could get some money to fund I Love New York? So even if they make it a statewide policy that collects on everything, that doesn't necessarily mean that policy will allow remittance back to the county that derives revenue.
Any other questions? Jay?
Hey, Laura, how does this affect our contract with, budget covering?
So for 2020, again, we cut off just about everything except some of the social media and, some of the platforms that we've worked really hard to build, and we just didn't want to lose that following. So they've basically been told, around 100,000 is the maximum that you can spend for the year, and they're pretty much sticking to that. As you know, we reduced the amount allocated to both CCE and Lake Salah. We haven't invoiced from Lake Salah. We still don't have a contract from CCE. When we have a contract and invoice, we're budgeted for it in this year. For next year, you may recall that what we did was we created a contract with Black Dog, because this was the year that we would have had to go out to RFP, and given the unusual circumstances, it would be very difficult to put out an RFP when you have no clue how much money you're gonna have to spend. So Black Dog is contracted, and basically what the contract says is we will put the budget together in January, once we know what the county contribution and what the I Love New York contribution will be. So we know we'll have their services, we just have yet to have, completely straightened out a budget.
And I think the way we worded that authorization was that it was, scope of services and budget to be unilaterally agreed to by both parties. So if we say, no, that's too much for that scope of services, we don't have to sign the contract. And similarly, if Black Dog says that's too many services for not enough money, they don't have to sign. So we'll have some last minute negotiations with them once our budget is adopted.
Yeah, we put together a scope of services based on the tasks that were in this year's budget. So what remains to be done is allocating a dollar amount per task that would be done for next year. And again, until we know what the tourism landscape is likely to look like next year, I don't think we could put that budget together right now because we just don't know what it's gonna look like.
And we should have kudos to Black Dog too, because they were really good to work with when we came into this crisis. I mean, they sat down. And Mannix, both of them, I mean, they sat down at the table and had a good discussion, and hey, we understand the problem, and it's gonna be a problem for us, but let's see if we can work this out together, and I think that was a great situation, and we couldn't have better people to work with, so I just wanna throw that out there, because they didn't have to be that way.
Right.
And, they chose to be that way, so, good group, it was a good selection on our choice, because they were good to work with. Any questions, any questions? We're good? Trails is what we had left, right? Snowmobile trail funds.
So snowmobile, is a pass-through. It's, a lot of money that's generated at the state level through the registration of snowmobiles themselves. And then there's a long complicated grant system that's administered by my office that's based on the number of miles of certified trails in different classes and the work done by the various trail groups. Basically, we left the budget flat. We always budget the same thing. It's a statutorily dedicated funding source, that it's snowmobile registrations that go into a designated pot that are supposed to go out into this. I wouldn't anticipate it being subject to any across-the-board, state cut. However, as Mr. Henke will probably tell you, there is some questionable accounting at the state level as to whether all of the dedicated funds, such as, conservation funds, actually go where they're supposed to go. So, with that, we'll keep the budget flat. It's a dollar-for-dollar pass-through, so if we reduce the appropriation, we'll reduce the revenue. Really, we're just the municipal sponsor for a privately run trail system.
Okay, so additional, I have an other for, the Ag Committee. Earlier today, the Ag and Farmland Protection Board met. Ag District 5 was reviewed, on the committee's recommendation that we approve the report as amended. This committee needs to make a resolution to move to the full board to set a public hearing for Ag District 5 and the annual inclusion for a public hearing in October and the vote in November. So if I could have a motion, moved by Jay, seconded by Brian. Any further discussion, questions? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. That was the only other I had. Is there any other, Jay?
We had one more page, joint planning board here.
Oh, yeah, we do.
That's where we moved our contribution to the Lake Champlain, Lake George Regional Planning Board. It always used to be paid out of boards and councils, within the planning department budget, within 80/20. And then when we were going through all of the restructuring of the LCLGRPB, we thought it would be more clear to do this, and then lo and behold, the Comptroller actually had a department for them, so we created a department and threw them in there. So that is our contribution to the Regional Planning Board. It's set by the 5-county MOA, which is based on a formula that I'm sure Mr. O'Brien can recite in his sleep. Based on the formula, our contribution is up very negligibly year over year.
And
Hopefully,
hopefully,
chairman's salary, right?
and hopefully, if he is gonna recite it, it will be in his sleep and not our meeting. So, that was,
Darn.
Trying.
You had
Trying.
All right.
Go ahead.
The formula is assessed value and population, especially between the 5 counties forward. That's the formula.
Oh, great.
Is there anything else to come before ag and planning?
Later on, meeting.
Is there any more budget questions, or we good?
How about Brian's impeachment?
That's probably next.
Motion to adjourn, ag. Moved by Jay, seconded by Brian.
Yeah. Finance is adjourned.
Pitch works and torture in the program.
Thanks, everyone.
It's too easy.
I know, just use the power.